Tonight at 10, we have more evidence of the intense pressure on hospital A&E departments in England. Figures released to the BBC show a 47% rise in the number of people with mental health problems seeking help in accident and emergency. We'll have a special report on the urgent measures being taken in the community to try to tackle the problem. And we'll have other figures on the number of patients facing long waits in A&E departments. Also tonight, Jeremy Corbyn accused by some of his own MPs of causing confusion on Labour's policy on immigration.
We're not wedded to free movement to the EU as a point of principle, but I don't want to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out.
Police in York name a 7-year-old girl who died after being found seriously injured yesterday afternoon. Tens of thousands of travellers experienced another day of disruption because of strikes by Southern Railway with no resolution in sight. And we pay tribute to the journalist who first reported the outbreak of the Second World War. She's died at the age of 105.
In the south, more on the strike action by Southern Rail drivers. Another difficult day for commuters, with 2 more strike days still to come. And on trial for the murder of his business partner, who was missing for more than 2 years.
Good evening. There's been a significant increase in the number of people with mental health problems asking to be seen at accident and emergency departments in England. Figures from NHS Digital, analysed for the BBC, show that in the year 2015-16, there were over 165,000 psychiatric attendances at A&E departments. That is a rise of 47% over the past 4 years, and it includes a rise of 89% in the number of children and young people attending A&E. Doctors say the reality is even worse than the figures suggest. Our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt has the story and reports from Birmingham.
It's another day of unrelenting demand in the emergency department of Birmingham's Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
Have any movement in terms of beds?
Patients are lining up on trolleys in the corridor, and the waiting room is packed.
Customer, counter 1, please.
She's taken an overdose of some prescribed medication.
The psychiatric team based in the department is dealing with a number of people who've tried to take their own lives.
She had a follow-on plan. She had taken an overdose the last time.
Among them, a woman in her early 20s. Doctors have dealt with the physical effects of the overdose, but the root cause is her history of mental health problems.
What's happened? I mean, what's brought you into A&E today?
I took an overdose. I went up to the train track.
She is one of a rapidly increasing number of patients arriving at A&Es like this with psychiatric difficulties. Many are young.
The voices are getting more intense, wanting to harm myself. It's not attempts, it's actually trying to do it, not just doing it as a cry for help.
Is this the worst that you've ever felt?
I've never been this bad before. I'm scared.
In a busy A&E, even finding a room for this conversation was a struggle. Now this isn't the right place for her, but she needs to be monitored.
It actually has suicide intent, you know, although if we were to discharge her from here, she would likely kind of like go out there and try and do something even riskier.
Was there any particular trigger why you took the tablets?
At this hospital, they see more than 100 people a week facing a psychiatric crisis. And the Mental Health Trust has set up a quiet unit nearby to assess people away from the pressure. Its staff then search for the psychiatric beds or community support needed.
OK, we need to admit this lady. I'm trying to act upon this as a matter of urgency for this lad because he doesn't sound well at all. Nobody in a mental health crisis should be in accident and emergency unless they've got a physical health need. Our A&Es, what I see, they are very, very busy, overstimulated places, you know, and somebody in the with a mental health issue, it's just not conducive at all to them to be in that environment.
That's why in Birmingham they've set up this street triage team to intervene before people reach the emergency department.
Patient hearing voices stating going to kill someone.
With a police officer, paramedic and psychiatric nurse on board, they respond to 999 calls where there are mental health concerns.
I'm a nurse, my name's Lisa, OK, and we're the triage team.
Already this evening, the man they're visiting has called for an ambulance several times. His physical health is checked. They listen to and assess him.
You were telling me that there was these negative voices in your head at the moment.
I think like there's someone controlling me. It's kind of like I'm some kind of machine.
After half an hour, it's agreed rather than going to A&E, he'll keep a community appointment in the morning. Has it helped, having the visit?
I think the first step is me asking for help, as well as being assured that I will get the help.
Over the last 4 or 5 weeks, he's been going to A&E quite a lot. I think he's had 6 admissions through A&E. So we've come out tonight to try and prevent that cycle.
Night and day, the street triage team is in demand. But here they believe it's making a difference in getting people the right help.
We managed to reduce the numbers of attendants to the A&E, but what you get high quality. You get mental health, police forces and paramedics working in collaboration together to look after one single patient.
For many, A&E will remain the first place they turn to. The challenge is to help people who are vulnerable before they reach a crisis.
Well, that was Alison's report from Birmingham, and she's with me now. When we look at the range of reasons for this sharp rise in these figures, Alison, what would you direct us to?
Well, it is a complicated picture, but better recording and an increased awareness of mental health issues generally is part of the picture, but certainly doesn't explain the significant increase. Campaigners say if people are turning to accident and emergency when they're in crisis, or sometimes they're directed there by professionals, then that's a sign, they say, that services in the community are just not keeping up with demand, or they're not the right services to provide people with the care that prevents them from reaching that crisis point. Also, doctors say these statistics do underestimate the problem because they only show people who are recorded by staff as having psychiatric reasons for being there as the main reason. So, for instance, if someone turned up having self-harmed, although there would be mental health issues involved, it would go in a different column of statistics and it'll be recorded in another way. Tonight, the Department of Health has said that the Prime Minister has made it very clear that they are committed to improving mental health care across the board, both in the NHS and in the community, for people who need it.
OK, Alison, again, thanks very much. Alison, hold that for us. Well, another set of official NHS figures seen by the BBC show that so far this year, tens of thousands of patients in England have waited hours on trolleys before being admitted to hospital. This winter is proving to be one of the busiest on record for accident and emergency departments. But the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has insisted that most of England's hospitals, in his view, are coping well. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, has more details.
You got any pain anywhere? No.
A 92-year-old patient at one hospital A&E unit today.
I've been laying there so long, it just hurts.
Okay.
An ageing population, one factor behind rising patient demand. Here it's even more hectic than usual, with an astonishing 20% more patients than this time last year. They're urging people to stay away and seek care elsewhere if their health problem isn't urgent.
The beginning of January is always a busy time, and it's much busier than this time last year. I think we will make it through the winter, but it is going to be really hard for us.
Since Christmas, the NHS has been under immense pressure, with some of the busiest ever days in hospitals. Now the BBC has obtained internal NHS figures revealing the scale of the pressure and problems in England last week, including numbers of patients lying on trolleys for hours at a time because beds weren't available. The figures cover the 7-day period ending yesterday morning and come from 131 hospital trusts in England. They show that 485 people waited longer than 12 hours on trolleys over that week, whereas only 158 patients faced those long waits in the whole of January last year. Last week, only one hospital trust hit the target of assessing 95% of A&E patients within 4 hours, and more than half of trusts failed to see even 80%.
So is it the end of the 4-hour waiting times?
The Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt hinted yesterday the 4-hour target might be changed to cover urgent cases only.
How are we going to explain to the public what your intention is?
Earlier, Mr Hunt said some A&Es had very serious problems, but according to service leaders, most had coped better than last year. There were warnings, though, from one expert. There were no easy solutions.
Not Mr Hunt. Over the last 30 years, we've reduced the number of beds to about half, and we've increased the number of admissions to about double. And so it's a sort of reaching a crisis situation, I would say.
The trolley weight data in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are not directly comparable to England. An NHS source said the figures obtained by the BBC didn't cover all hospitals, but there was unprecedented patient demand. Pressure on social care services and a shortage of mental health crisis care are among factors stretching A&E services harder than ever before. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Jeremy Corbyn has been accused by some of his own MPs of creating confusion after declaring that Labour was not wedded to freedom of movement for EU citizens, and then adding that he wasn't ruling it out either. The Labour leader insisted that Labour did understand voters' concerns about immigration. Earlier, Mr Corbyn had prompted further criticism from his own side when he suggested that capping earnings would be a good way to tackle inequality in pay. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg has more details.
A welcome for him on the platform. But will you welcome what was billed as his vision for Britain after Brexit?
Whether you voted to leave or remain, everybody voted for a better future.
On the biggest question, how many EU citizens can keep coming to Britain to move freely? What was his verdict?
We're not wedded to free movement to the EU as a point of principle, but I don't want to be misinterpreted, nor do we rule it out. We'll demand that these negotiations give us the power to intervene decisively to prevent workers from here or abroad being used and exploited to undermine pay and conditions at work.
The original version of his speech had suggested freedom of movement might be ditched, but instead he wants to tighten up rules at work that allow foreign workers to be exploited.
Does that mean that you would like to see more or fewer people from other parts of the European Union coming to the UK?
It probably means there would be fewer, but I think we should also recognise that there is a massive contribution made to our health service, education and manufacturing industry by people from all over Europe.
You say there would probably be fewer people coming here. By how many? What kind of reduction?
I can't put a figure on it because we haven't yet seen the work that has to be done.
Isn't this a question of principle though, really? About the kind of levels that you're happy with?
That employers should not be allowed to tear up existing arrangements in the construction industry or other industries.
We've asked you previously whether or not you think the levels are too high, and you said that you don't think the levels are too high. Have you changed your mind?
No. My mind is quite clear that we need to end the exploitation that's going on. We need to maintain a market access within Europe, and we need to ensure there are good relations between all communities.
But do you or do you not want to end the wide principle of freedom of movement?
I want us to have market access in Europe. I want us to have trade with Europe, and let's.
And that means continuing with freedom of movement.
Let's see what comes out of these negotiations.
Mr Corbyn was in Peterborough, a town whose face has been changed by immigration. The kind of place where Labour MPs worry their leader's approach does them no favours.
Immigration has been good for Peterborough, but the amount of immigration has not been good for Peterborough.
A lot of foreigners, they're quite nice, but the island can't cope and the system can't cope.
I find Labour quite confusing. I don't really understand what their issues are.
But Mr Corbyn hopes he might have more appeal on how we earn our pounds and pence. Far from party policy yet, but income limits could be on the way.
I think you have to look at each company and say, well, is it really right that the chief executive should earn 100 or more times than those who are actually doing the work that are keeping that company going? Either you do a cap or you look at the levels of disparity within organisations.
After being expected to change direction today, in the end the Labour leader more or less stayed on the spot.
Turn around twice then.
For his supporters, it's sticking to principles that makes him their hero. For many of his MPs, it's stubbornness that means the party could be doomed to fail. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News.
Police in York have named a 7-year-old girl who died after being found seriously injured in a field yesterday afternoon. Katie Ruff died in hospital. A teenage girl is being questioned about her death. Our correspondent Danny Savage reports now from York.
This is 7-year-old Katie Ruff, found with fatal injuries in a playing field in York late yesterday afternoon. Her grandparents describe her as their darling princess. Friends came to leave flowers close to where she was discovered today.
She was a very close friend to my daughter, and truly unique, beautiful little girl. Respect the family, beautiful family.
People living in this small cul-de-sac tried to help Katie's mother, who arrived just after the little girl was found.
A woman ran up the street. I was obviously the mother of the daughter. She was shouting help, called for an ambulance. So I put my shoes on and went to go up the alleyway. And I got halfway up and I could see a body lying in the field, but the police were already there attending.
7-year-old Katie died a short time later in hospital. Tonight, police say a 15-year-old girl arrested in connection with what happened here is still in custody. And they're appealing for anyone who saw Katie Rough with an older girl around here yesterday afternoon to contact them. Danny Savage, BBC News, York.
Now, in the past half hour, a jury in Charleston, South Carolina, has condemned a man to death for the racist killing of 9 black men and a woman in a church shooting in June of 2015. Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, had told a sentencing hearing that he felt he had to carry out the killings. The jury had an option to sentence Roof to life imprisonment, but instead chose the death penalty. The Democratic Unionist leader and former First Minister Arlene Foster has said that Northern Ireland is undoubtedly heading for a period of direct rule from Westminster. The power-sharing government there is in crisis following the resignation of Sinn Féin's Martin McGuinness as Deputy First Minister. The main cause of the dispute is the mishandling of an energy scheme which could cost the taxpayer hundreds of millions of pounds. Our correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports now from Belfast.
The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland.
It all has echoes of unhappier times. In the House of Commons, a British minister was making an emergency statement.
Right Honourable and Honourable Members should be in no doubt. The situation we face in Northern Ireland today is grave, and the government treats it with the utmost seriousness.
The situation to which he was referring was the collapse of the power-sharing government at Stormont. A decade of broad consensus between Republicans and Unionists has broken down. On the surface, it's about a green energy scheme, the cost of which was found to have been exorbitant. The scheme was originally overseen by the Democratic Unionist leader and now former First Minister Arlene Foster.
The major sticking point between us over this last few weeks has been the fact that Sinn Féin would not agree to the establishment of an inquiry until I stepped aside as First Minister. For me, I felt to have done so would have led to the conclusion that I was guilty of something improper, which is not the case.
Across in West Belfast, the leader of Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams, was issuing 2 warnings. A return to direct rule from London would not be acceptable, and neither would a return to the same power-sharing arrangements with the Democratic Unionists after an election.
If the DUP think that they're going to waltz out of government or have an election and then waltz back into government on the same terms as caused the collapse, then they'll have to make their minds up.
The politics of Northern Ireland can seem pretty impenetrable from outside, but here's the essential point. It took years to put together a successful power-sharing government here. That government oversaw peace and stability. That government has collapsed. There is a vacuum, there is uncertainty about how to put it all back together. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Belfast.
Hundreds of thousands of commuters in the south of England have struggled to get to and from work today because of the latest strike by Southern Rail staff. The dispute, which has been going on for nearly 10 months, is about staffing duties on trains. The unions say that they're trying to protect the safety of passengers and crew. Our transport correspondent Richard Westcott reports now from East Croydon.
Paralysed by a strike. Again. More than 2,200 Southern services weren't running today.
Platform 2 for the delayed 0747 Thameslink service.
Their passengers were forced to find other routes in.
The whole situation seems like a complete joke.
I'd like to know that when I get on the train that I'm going to end up at my destination at a certain time.
Well, this is the queue just to get into East Croydon station. All of these people are trying to get to London. It's about 9:15 commuter time. That's the start of the queue there. It snakes around a lot. Then actually goes down the side of the station, probably about 100 metres or so, down that way.
For nearly a year, they've been rowing about changes to the role of the on-board guard. Southern wants drivers to take over, closing the train doors. The unions say that threatens safety and jobs. Southern says no one's losing their post, and the safety regulator is happy with the changes. There's no sign of a breakthrough. This is the Body Shop's new £1 million lab in Croydon. They moved hundreds of staff here last year because of the great train service. But Southern's drivers aren't working overtime at the moment, causing delays and cancellations every single day. It's having a devastating effect on the Body Shop staff.
They're missing children's birthdays, they can't arrange meetings, they're having arguments at home, they're feeling stressed, tired and irritable. And there's a number of people who are saying every day from about 4 o'clock they're sitting getting more and more stressed about whether they're going to get home at all or on time for the commitment they've got that night.
Back on board, several commuters said this.
I mean, the government needs to do something about it. It's ridiculous.
So the BBC put the question to the Minister.
What are you as Transport Secretary doing about it though? Don't you have a duty to step in on behalf?
The government's engaged day in, day out in trying to find a way to get this issue resolved, and will carry on doing that.
In Merseyside, unions are fighting similar plans to bring in driver-only operated trains. It's Southern today, but this issue threatens to spread across Britain. Richard Westcott, BBC News, Croydon.
Now, in just a few hours' time, President Obama will deliver his farewell speech in Chicago, the city where he claimed victory in the presidential election 8 years ago. But as his second term as the 44th President of the United States comes to a close, how will he be remembered? In his second report looking back at Mr. Obama's time in office, our North America editor John Sopel looks at the international issues which have defined the Obama presidency.
There was always something upside down about Barack Obama receiving the Nobel Peace Prize before he'd really done anything as president. When he came to office, one of the greatest strategic threats was Iran, a resurgent power in the region. But more important than that was securing a multinational deal to curb Tehran's nuclear ambitions. An agreement struck despite fierce opposition from Israel's Prime Minister.
When Benjamin Netanyahu came to address the Congress nearly 2 years ago, there was fury in the White House. They were angry that an invitation had been extended by Republican leaders and accepted without the president knowing. But very soon, someone much more to the Israeli Prime Minister's liking will be occupying the White House. And the question the world is asking, will the Iran nuclear deal survive the change of power?
For over a year, we've been told that no deal is better than a bad deal. Well, this is a bad deal. It's a very bad deal.
His relationship with Netanyahu was one of the lows, culminating in the US refusing to veto a UN resolution critical of Israel's policy of settlement building. The chemistry with the Russian leader Vladimir Putin was no better. Crimea, cyber espionage and Syria left them barely speaking. The pledge at the start of his presidency was all about disengaging from costly conflicts and bringing the troops back home. In 2011, President Obama achieved something the Bush administration did not, the successful tracking down and raid to kill public enemy number one.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda.
The raid and promise of the Arab Spring would soon be replaced by a Middle East in flames, and the rise of so-called Islamic State, the fight against which remains unfinished business. Arguably, the low point for President Obama in the Middle East has been Syria, which has been a humanitarian catastrophe, sparking the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And the president's failure to act against President Assad, despite much huffing and puffing, has come back to haunt him.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
But nothing happened, no action.
I think it was a mistake not to enforce the red line. When the United States says very clearly that there will be costs and consequences for a certain action, I think it's important to follow up on that action. But I also wouldn't confuse that, enforcing the chemical weapons red line, with the notion that there was some interventionist fix to the Syria problem.
Barack Obama's policy towards Syria is very much like the country's embassy here in Washington, D.C. an empty shell, newspapers piling up on the doorstep, the windows barred. And in the talks to bring peace to the country, America isn't at the table. Barack Obama has flip-flopped over whether to take military action, too slow to react to the dangers of so-called Islamic State. It's been a period in which American influence has waned and Russian has increased. From one empty embassy to another that has had new life breathed into it. This is the Cuban embassy in northwest Washington. For over 50 years, it had lain derelict, a last legacy, if you like, of the Cold War. In the warmth of a Caribbean island, Barack Obama consigned the last piece of icy Cold War legacy to history. Cuba had brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. Now diplomatic relations are restored, an extraordinary transformation. He leaves office largely admired and popular around the world, not least for his role in the global climate change deal. He tried to carve out a foreign policy that he saw as right for the times. But as the Commander-in-Chief was given the traditional send-off, in his own way, was he as destructive to US power and influence as his predecessor, George W. Bush? And what would the Nobel Committee make of him 8 years on? John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Just to let you know, there will be live coverage of President Obama's farewell speech from the city of Chicago. It's at 2 o'clock in the morning British time on the BBC News channel. Now, Sir David Clementi, a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, is to be the next chairman of the BBC. The appointment of Sir David was announced after it was approved by the Prime Minister's office. He faces the task of leading a new board to oversee how the BBC is run, while the media watchdog Ofcom takes over the regulation of the BBC's content. Football's world governing body, FIFA, has approved plans to expand the World Cup from 32 to 48 teams. The new format will be introduced from 2026 and the bulk of the additional slots likely to go to African and Asian countries. Our sports news correspondent Richard Conway reports from Zurich, where he's been talking to FIFA's new boss, Gianni Infantino.
It is one of the biggest prizes in world sport. Now, after FIFA's decision to expand the competition, 16 more countries have the chance to get their hands on the World Cup.
We're all set up.
Speaking to me today, the world governing body's president insisted, in the face of much criticism, it's time for the sport to look beyond its traditional borders.
Football has now become a truly global game, because many more countries, many more teams will have the chance to qualify. So they will invest in developing football, they will invest in developing elite football as well as grassroots football.
The growth of the World Cup will bring enormous extra revenue. FIFA stand to make an additional £500 million in profit in 2026, according to its own research. But the man elected as FIFA president, partly on a pledge to deliver a bigger competition, insists it's not about cash or politics.
Well, it's not at all a money and power grab. It's actually the opposite. It's a football decision. So the way we presented it was, okay, we presented 4 formats. Every one of the 4 formats has advantages in terms of the financial situation, which means that we are in a comfortable situation to be able to take a decision simply based on the sporting merit.
Asia, where interest in football is booming, and Africa stand to benefit the most when the extra 16 places are divided up. There will be more slots too for European nations. The Scottish FA welcomed today's decision, believing it will give them and others a better chance at qualifying. After a number of years when FIFA was a byword for corruption, its new leadership is determined to assert itself. Gianni Infantino's task is to now convince his critics a reformed World Cup can be a force for good. Richard Conway, BBC News, Zurich.
The former war correspondent Claire Hollingworth, who reported the outbreak of the Second World War, has died at the age of 105. She was the first journalist to report on the build-up of German troops on the Polish border in 1939, and she went on to witness some of the most significant events of the 20th century. Our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, knew Claire Hollingworth. He's been looking back at her life and achievements.
This is the National Programme from London.
Germany has invaded Poland and has bombed many towns.
It was Claire Hollingworth's first story. 3 days earlier, she'd spotted the build-up of German armour ready for the invasion.
I rode along a valley and there was tarpaulin up to prevent you looking down into the valley. And suddenly a gust of wind blew the tarpaulin away from the moorings. And I looked down into the valley and there were scores, if not hundreds of tanks lined up.
That set the pattern for her long career, scoop after scoop.
Mr. Harold Philby on the right.
It was Claire who broke the news of Kim Philby's defection to Russia, though her newspaper, The Guardian, fearing a libel suit, wouldn't use it at first. In Vietnam, she was a fearless war correspondent.
I'm really passionately interested in war, and if one is passionately interested in war, one can't help like being in it.
Despite her bad eyesight and slight build, she was remarkably tough and used her auntie-ish appearance to great effect. Once in East Berlin, she spotted a brand new Soviet tank. The crew had wandered off, so she clambered onto it and got a look at the speedometer and the petrol gauge. The Russian soldiers came running back, furious, but she said innocently she was just trying to work out how to get back to the West. The next day, her paper led on the new tank's speed and range.
She was enormously admired. She was a pioneer. She led the way for all the tens of thousands of women journalists who are now working all over the world, and especially in wars. And I think she was almost fearless and absolutely dedicated to the business.
Happy birthday, dear Claire.
She remained a journalist into her 90s, and last year in Hong Kong, where she lived, her friends celebrated her 105th birthday. Claire Hollingworth had been a remarkable witness to the entire modern world.
The tributes today to the journalist Claire Hollingworth, who's died at the age of 105. Just to tell you that Newsnight is coming up on BBC Two, so here's Kirsty.
This was meant to be the day that Jeremy Corbyn set out a clear Labour policy on Brexit. I'll be asking one of his closest lieutenants why it was such a shambles. Join me now on BBC Two.
That's Newsnight with Kirsty here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.